In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed into the heart of Nazi Germany, a special unit of American intelligence officers was racing against time to reach a specific location before the Soviets. Their target was not a weapons facility or a military installation. It was a nondescript building in the outskirts of Berlin that housed the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the Reich Office for Land Survey. This was where Nazi Germany stored its most sensitive cartographic materials, maps and surveys that went far beyond normal geographic documentation. Among the thousands of documents hastily being burned by retreating German officers, the American team was searching for one specific collection of maps created during a 1938 expedition to Antarctica, maps that reportedly showed something impossible, as something that would change everything we thought we knew about human history. The team leader, Captain James Forrestal, had been briefed that these maps contained evidence of structures in Antarctica that predated modern civilization by thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years. More disturbing, the maps showed these structures with a level of detail that suggested the Germans had not just photographed them from the air, but had actually entered them, explored them, and documented what they found inside. When the team finally reached the survey office, they found it in flames. German officers had already begun the systematic destruction of classified materials, but in the chaos, not everything had been destroyed. In a basement vault that the demolition team had not yet reached, the Americans found metal cases containing the Antarctic expedition materials. Among them were the original survey maps created by Chief Cartographer Klaus von Neurath, along with his personal journals and photographic plates. What those documents contained would be immediately classified at the highest level, sealed away in archives, where they would remain hidden for over 7 decades. If you think you know the story of Nazi expeditions to Antarctica, if you believe the official narrative that they were simply looking for whaling stations and claiming territory, then what you are about to discover will fundamentally shatter your understanding of World War II, of ancient history, and of what lies beneath the ice at the bottom of the world. And make sure you hit subscribe and share this video because the evidence we are presenting has been locked in classified archives since 1945, and powerful forces still do not want this information becoming public knowledge. Klaus von Neurath was not a Nazi Party member by ideology. He was a cartographer, one of the finest Germany had produced, trained in advanced surveying techniques and possessing an almost supernatural ability to translate geographic data into precise maps. Before the war, he had worked on civilian projects, mapping remote regions of Africa and South America for German mining and exploration companies. But in 1937, he was approached by the German Navy with an offer he could not refuse. Germany was planning a major expedition to Antarctica, ostensibly to establish whaling operations and claim territory for the Reich. They needed the best cartographers available, and von Neurath was at the top of the list. What they did not tell him initially was that the expedition had objectives far beyond whaling and territorial claims. German intelligence had obtained information, sources he would never be allowed to know, suggesting that Antarctica contained evidence of ancient advanced civilizations, possibly even entrances to vast underground facilities that might house technology or resources of incalculable value. The expedition, designated New Swabia Expedition after the region of Antarctica they planned to explore, departed from Hamburg on December 17, 1938, aboard the MS Schwabenland, a German aircraft carrier converted for polar research. The crew consisted of 82 men, including scientists, military officers, and support personnel. But there was also a contingent of SS officers, highly unusual for what was officially a scientific expedition. Von Neurath later wrote in his journal that he found their presence unsettling, that they seemed to have their own agenda separate from the official mission parameters. The ship carried 2 Dornier flying boats equipped with specially modified cameras capable of aerial photography in extreme cold conditions. These aircraft would be used to conduct systematic surveys of the Antarctic coast and interior, creating the most detailed maps of the region ever produced. The MS Schwabenland reached Antarctic waters on January 19, 1939, after weeks of travel through increasingly hostile seas. The expedition established a base camp on the Antarctic coast in an area that would later be called New Schwabenland, or New Swabia, claimed by Germany as its Antarctic territory. From this base, the Dornier aircraft began systematic survey flights, photographing over 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic landscape. The official story says these flights mapped previously uncharted territory, planted thousands of Nazi flags with metal poles to mark German claims, and documented areas suitable for potential whaling stations. But von Neurath's journals tell a different story. According to his private notes, the expedition was following coordinates provided by German intelligence. Coordinates that supposedly mark the locations of anomalous features detected through analysis of earlier expedition data, and possibly through other means that von Neurath was not cleared to know about. On the third survey flight, January 27, 1939, von Neurath's aircraft flew inland beyond the coastal regions into the heart of the Antarctic continent. His journal entry for that day begins normally, describing the ice formations and mountain ranges they photographed. But then the tone changes abruptly. At approximately 2 p.m., flying at an altitude of 3,000 meters, we observe something that should not exist. Rising from the ice plain were structures, clearly artificial, geometric in form, and massive in scale. The pilot, Captain Richer, immediately descended to 1,000 meters to allow better photography. What we saw defies rational explanation. The structures appear to be made of stone or possibly metal, partially buried in ice, but with enough exposed to confirm they are not natural formations. Some appear to be pyramidal, others are more complex architectural forms with what might be entrances or passages. The scale is immense. The smallest visible structure is at least 50 meters tall. The largest may be over 150 meters. I photographed everything, though I fear my hands were shaking too much from shock to maintain perfect precision. The crew wanted to land and investigate on foot, but Captain Richer denied the request, stating they did not have authorization for ground investigation and needed to return to base to report the discovery. Von Neurath noted that the SS officers aboard the aircraft seemed unsurprised by the discovery, as if they had expected to find something, which suggested to him that German intelligence had known or suspected these structures existed before the expedition even began. Over the next 2 weeks, multiple flights were conducted over the area, systematically photographing and mapping the structures. Von Neurath created detailed cartographic surveys showing the locations, dimensions, and spatial relationships of what he counted as at least 15 major structures and possibly dozens of smaller ones. His maps included notations about architectural features, estimated sizes, and hypotheses about what the structures might be. In his journal, he speculated that they could be remnants of an ancient civilization that existed before Antarctica froze. Or possibly something even stranger. On February 9, 1939, permission was finally granted for a ground expedition to one of the structures. A team of 12 men, including von Neurath, 2 SS officers, 3 scientists, and 6 support personnel, landed near what appeared to be the most accessible structure, a pyramidal form approximately 80 meters tall with one face partially cleared of ice by wind erosion. Approaching on foot, von Neurath documented everything with photographs and sketches. The structure's surface was smooth, too smooth to be natural rock, and showed what might be seams or construction joints, though at a scale suggesting the builders were working with massive blocks, or possibly using some kind of molding or casting technique. Near the base, they found what appeared to be an entrance. A rectangular opening about 5 meters wide and 8 meters tall, partially filled with ice but clearly artificial. The opening was too regular, too precise to be a natural cave formation. The team cleared enough ice from the entrance to allow passage, and von Neurath became one of the first modern humans to enter what he believed was a structure built by an ancient Antarctic civilization. Inside, the temperature was noticeably warmer than outside, though still well below freezing. Von Neurath attributed this to geothermal heat from below, but later he would wonder if there was another explanation. The entrance passage extended approximately 20 meters before opening into a vast chamber. Von Neurath's description, written by flashlight in his journal that evening, captures the wonder and terror of that moment. The chamber is circular, approximately 40 meters in diameter and at least 20 meters high. The walls are covered in symbols and markings that resemble no known writing system. They are not random or decorative. They are organized, systematic, clearly intended to convey information. Some appear mathematical, geometric patterns, and numerical notations. Others are more pictographic, showing figures that might be humans or might be something else, celestial objects, and scenes that could be historical records or instructions. One section of wall shows what appears to be a star map, though identifying which stars it represents would require extensive analysis. The floor of the chamber was relatively clear of ice, covered instead with a thin layer of frost over what appeared to be stone or possibly a synthetic material that had not degraded despite obvious immense age. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform with an object that von Neurath could not adequately describe. It was approximately 3 meters tall, cylindrical in shape, made from a material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to see clearly even with flashlights directed at it. The surface was covered in more of the strange symbols, and there appeared to be crystalline elements embedded in it. One of the scientists, Dr. Hartmann, approached the object with measurement equipment and reported unusual electromagnetic readings emanating from it. And though the equipment was not sophisticated enough to determine exactly what kind of energy was being detected, the SS officers prevented anyone from touching or attempting to move the object, stating that it would be photographed and documented, but not disturbed until Berlin sent further instructions. Von Neurath spent hours sketching and photographing the chamber, the walls, and the central object from every angle. He noted additional passages leading from the main chamber deeper into the structure, but before they could be explored, the SS officers ordered evacuation. Von Neurath later learned that the decision came from Berlin via radio communication. The expedition was to document the structures, but not conduct extensive exploration. A larger, better-equipped expedition would return to conduct detailed investigation. Now, that follow-up expedition, however, would never happen. Within 7 months, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began, consuming all resources and attention. The Antarctic discoveries would be shelved, though not forgotten by those at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Von Neurath and his team emerged from the structure after approximately 4 hours inside. His journal notes that everyone felt disoriented, as if time had behaved strangely while they were underground. What they thought was 4 hours turned out to be nearly 7 hours by their watches, though no one could account for the missing time. They had not been unconscious or asleep, yet somehow hours had passed without their awareness. This temporal anomaly troubled von Neurath deeply, and he mentioned it in his report to the expedition leadership. Just the SS officers dismissed it as instrument error or psychological effects of the extreme environment, but von Neurath was certain their timepieces had been functioning correctly. Something about the structure or the object within it had affected their perception of time, or possibly had actually affected time itself in localized ways that physics could not explain. Upon returning to the base camp, von Neurath immediately began the painstaking work of creating detailed cartographic maps of the region, integrating the aerial photography with his ground observations and measurements. These maps would become his masterpiece and his curse, documents so detailed and so disturbing in their implications that they would be classified for over 70 years. Yet the maps showed not just the surface structures, but his hypothetical reconstructions of what might lie beneath the ice, extrapolations based on the architectural patterns he observed, and mathematical models of how structures partially visible would likely continue underground. His reconstruction suggested a city, possibly several cities, with the structures they found representing only the tops of buildings that might extend hundreds of meters below the current ice level. If this reconstruction was accurate, the cities would have been built when Antarctica was not ice-covered, which according to conventional geology would be at least 15 million years ago, long before humans existed. But von Neurath's geological knowledge suggested another possibility. Recent research in the 1930s had begun to question the timeline of Antarctic glaciation. Some geologists proposed that parts of Antarctica might have been ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, possibly even more recently in certain geothermally active regions. If the structures were built during one of these ice-free periods, they could have been constructed by an advanced civilization contemporary with or predating ancient Egypt and Sumer. Von Neurath included these speculations in his written report. though he noted they were controversial and would require extensive geological and archaeological investigation to confirm. He also included something that would make his maps truly dangerous to the established narrative of history. He noted similarities between the symbols found in the Antarctic structures and symbols found in ancient sites around the world, particularly in South America and the Middle East. He had brought reference materials on the expedition, books on ancient civilizations and writing systems, thinking they might be useful for scientific documentation. Comparing the Antarctic symbols to his references, he found what he believed were matches. Some symbols appeared nearly identical to those found in pre-Inca structures in Peru and Bolivia. Others resembled Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphics, not in meaning which he could not determine, but in form and structure. This suggested to him that whoever built the Antarctic structures might have had contact with or influence on ancient human civilizations. Or possibly that all these civilizations derived their knowledge from a common source, an older global civilization that was destroyed but left fragments of its knowledge scattered across the world. These conclusions were explosive, threatening to overturn not just history and archaeology, but also the Nazi ideology of Aryan supremacy. If an advanced non-European civilization predated all known history, the Nazi racial theories were built on false premises. Von Neurath was careful in how he presented his findings. He stuck to factual observations and clearly labeled his interpretations as hypotheses requiring further investigation. But he was also honest about what he had seen and what it implied. His maps showed the structures with accurate scale and position. His photographs provided visual evidence. His written reports documented the expedition in detail. He created multiple copies of everything, knowing that such controversial materials might be suppressed or destroyed. He gave one complete set to the expedition commander, Captain Richer, as required, but he also created 2 additional sets, one of which he hid among his personal effects and later smuggled back to his family home in Bavaria, and another which he entrusted to a colleague who was not part of the Nazi Party, and whom von Neurath believed might be able to get the materials to neutral scientific authorities if necessary. Why were the Nazis so interested in Antarctica and ancient civilizations? To understand this, we need to understand the occult obsessions of the Nazi leadership and their desperate search for any advantage that might ensure German victory. Yet Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was fascinated by ancient history, archaeology, and esoteric traditions. He established the Ahnenerbe, a research organization dedicated to studying ancient Germanic history and proving the superiority of the Aryan race. But the Ahnenerbe's research went far beyond conventional archaeology. They sent expeditions to Tibet, searching for the origins of the Aryan race, investigated occult traditions and artifacts that might provide mystical power, and pursued theories about ancient advanced technologies that could be recovered and weaponized. Himmler and others in the Nazi leadership believed that ancient civilizations, possibly pre-flood civilizations mentioned in myths and religious texts, had possessed technologies far beyond anything modern science had achieved. If these technologies could be found and reverse engineered, Germany would gain weapons and capabilities that would make victory inevitable. The Antarctic expedition was part of this larger program. German intelligence had collected reports from various sources suggesting that Antarctica might contain remnants of ancient civilizations. Some of these reports came from analysis of the Piri Reis map, a 1613 Turkish map that appears to show the Antarctic coastline without ice, suggesting it was copied from much older source maps created when Antarctica was not frozen. Other reports came from occult sources, psychics and channelers who claimed to receive information from ancient spirits or extraterrestrial entities describing civilizations that existed before recorded history. Yet while mainstream scientists dismissed these sources as nonsense, the Nazi leadership took them seriously enough to fund expeditions and research. The discovery of actual structures in Antarctica seemed to validate their investment and encourage them to pursue even more aggressive exploration of ancient sites and occult knowledge. Von Neurath was aware of these ideological undercurrents, though he tried to maintain scientific objectivity. In his journal, he expressed discomfort with how his discoveries might be used. He feared that the structures and artifacts would be interpreted through the lens of Nazi racial ideology, twisted to support claims of Aryan supremacy or used to justify atrocities. He also feared the technological implications. If advanced technology was found in the Antarctic structures and could be weaponized, thus it might extend the war and increase the death toll to unimaginable levels. He found himself in an ethical dilemma. As a scientist, he wanted the truth about the structures to be known and studied. But as a human being witnessing the rise of evil in his country, he feared what would happen if that truth fell into the wrong hands. This dilemma would haunt him for the rest of his life, and ultimately lead to decisions that would change the course of history in small but significant ways. As World War II intensified, plans for a return expedition to Antarctica were developed but never executed. Von Neurath was consulted multiple times between 1940 and 1943 about what equipment and personnel would be needed for a comprehensive exploration of the structures. Yet the SS proposed an expedition of over 300 personnel, including archaeologists, engineers, physicists, and a military contingent to establish a permanent base. The goal was to conduct extensive excavation of the structures, document everything found inside, and remove any artifacts or technology that might be useful to the German war effort. Particular interest focused on the cylindrical object von Neurath had documented in the main chamber. The electromagnetic readings suggested it might be some kind of power source or energy device, and Nazi scientists hoped it could be studied and replicated. But the expedition never materialized. By 1943, Germany was losing the war on multiple fronts. Resources that might have funded Antarctic exploration were desperately needed for military operations. Thus, the Battle of Stalingrad had ended in catastrophic defeat. Allied bombing campaigns were devastating German cities. The idea of sending hundreds of personnel and massive resources to Antarctica became impractical. However, some researchers claim that smaller classified expeditions did occur between 1942 and 1945, using submarines to transport small teams of SS officers and scientists to Antarctica for purposes that were never officially documented. These claims are difficult to verify, as most records from this period were destroyed, but there are suggestive pieces of evidence. German U-boats were detected in South Atlantic waters at times, and locations that made no strategic sense unless they were traveling to or from Antarctica. After the war, but several U-boat commanders were interrogated and made cryptic references to special missions to polar regions. Von Neurath himself was approached in late 1943 about participating in what was described as a final Antarctic mission, but he declined, claiming health problems from his earlier exposure to extreme cold. In truth, according to journal entries from this period, he was becoming increasingly horrified by the Nazi regime and wanted no part in helping them acquire potential weapons or technology. He had already begun making plans to defect, or at least to ensure his research would not be used for military purposes. He made contact through intermediaries with Allied intelligence, offering to provide information about German secret projects in exchange for protection for himself and his family. So the negotiations were delicate and slow, complicated by the fact that von Neurath was not involved in weapons development and therefore did not have intelligence of immediate military value. But eventually, arrangements were made. Von Neurath would continue his work, maintaining his cover, while secretly documenting everything he knew about Nazi occult and archaeological programs, including the Antarctic discoveries. When American forces finally captured the Reich Office for Land Survey in April 1945, they were acting on intelligence provided in part by von Neurath himself. He had sent word through his intelligence contacts about the location of the Antarctic materials and their significance. The Americans were primarily interested in German military maps and strategic documents, but Captain James Forrestal, who led the recovery team, had been specifically briefed about the Antarctic expedition materials and told to prioritize their recovery. Forrestal was not just a military officer. He was attached to a classified program that dealt with anomalous discoveries, things that did not fit conventional understanding and needed to be studied away from public scrutiny. Finding von Neurath's maps and journals was a major intelligence coup. The materials were immediately packed and shipped to the United States, where they were delivered to a classified facility for analysis. Von Neurath himself survived the war and briefly met with American intelligence officers in June 1945. He provided additional context for his maps and journals, explaining what he had found and what he believed it meant. He urged the Americans to launch their own expedition to verify his findings and to ensure the structures were studied by international scientists rather than kept secret or exploited by any single nation. The Americans were polite but non-committal. They thanked him for his cooperation, assured him his family would be protected, and then classified everything he had told them. Von Neurath was essentially placed under house arrest, though it was called protective custody. He was not allowed to publish his findings or speak publicly about the Antarctic expedition. He was given a small pension and permitted to live quietly in Bavaria, but he was monitored for the rest of his life. The frustration of this situation weighed on him heavily. He had made what he believed was one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history, the evidence of advanced ancient civilization that could rewrite our understanding of human origins and development. But instead of being celebrated, he was silenced. His maps were locked away. His photographs were classified. The structures he found remained in Antarctica, unexplored and unstudied, while he was forced to remain silent. In his later years, he wrote extensively about his experiences, creating a detailed manuscript that he hoped might one day be published. He entrusted this manuscript to his daughter with instructions to wait until after his death and then to find a way to make the truth known. Klaus von Neurath died in 1974 at the age of 68. His daughter waited as instructed, but when she attempted to publish his manuscript in the 1980s, she was visited by government officials who informed her that the materials were still classified and publication would violate national security laws. Defeated and frightened, she placed the manuscript in storage and tried to forget about it. What makes von Neurath's Antarctic maps particularly significant is how they fit into a larger pattern of suppressed discoveries relating to ancient civilizations and advanced prehistoric cultures. Throughout the 20th century, numerous archaeological findings that challenged conventional history were either dismissed, classified, or quietly buried. Giant skeletons found in North America, suggesting human or humanoid species much larger than modern humans, were sent to the Smithsonian Institution and then disappeared from the records. Precision-machined artifacts found in coal deposits millions of years old, impossible according to conventional timelines, were labeled as hoaxes without serious investigation. Out-of-place artifacts or OOParts that showed evidence of advanced technology in ancient contexts were systematically ignored by mainstream archaeology. The pattern suggests deliberate suppression of any evidence that contradicts the established historical narrative. Why would this suppression occur? One explanation is simply institutional inertia and ego. Academic careers are built on established paradigms. Professors write textbooks, earn tenure, and gain reputations based on teaching and defending specific theories about history and human development. If those theories are proven wrong, decades of work become obsolete and institutional prestige is damaged. So there is enormous pressure within academia to reject any evidence that threatens established narratives, not necessarily through conscious conspiracy, but through the collective bias of experts who have too much invested in current theories to objectively evaluate contrary evidence. But there may also be more deliberate suppression by government and military authorities. If ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology, and if that technology can be recovered and understood, it represents potential military and economic advantage. Any nation that gains exclusive access to such technology would have overwhelming power. This creates incentive to classify discoveries, study them in secret, and prevent competitors from learning about them. The Antarctic structures fit this pattern perfectly. If they contain advanced technology, whoever controls Antarctica controls access to that technology. This explains the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which declared Antarctica an international scientific preserve where no military activities or resource exploitation could occur. On the surface, this treaty appears to be an idealistic agreement to preserve a pristine environment for peaceful scientific research. But some researchers believe the real purpose was to create a framework where major powers could cooperatively ensure that no single nation gained unilateral access to whatever was under the ice, while also limiting civilian and commercial access under the guise of environmental protection. The treaty effectively locked down Antarctica, at ensuring that exploration would be controlled by governments and that any significant discoveries would be managed through official channels that could maintain secrecy if desired. Von Neurath's maps, if released publicly, would undermine this controlled narrative. They provide specific coordinates and detailed documentation of structures that anyone with sufficient resources could attempt to visit and verify. They include photographs and sketches that make the reality of the discoveries difficult to deny. They come from a credible source, a trained professional cartographer with no apparent motive to fabricate evidence. This is why the maps remained classified for so long, and why even today, 70-plus years later, they have not been officially acknowledged or released. The structures are still there, under the ice, waiting. But those in power prefer that the public remains unaware, that no pressure builds for independent investigation, that the official narrative of Antarctic history as a frozen, uninhabited wasteland continues unchallenged. Since the advent of satellite imaging technology, particularly high-resolution synthetic aperture radar that can penetrate ice, evidence supporting von Neurath's claims has begun to emerge from sources that governments cannot easily control. In 2001, satellite radar mapping of Antarctica revealed massive structures beneath the ice in the region that von Neurath mapped, approximately matching the locations he documented in 1939. These structures show geometric patterns inconsistent with natural geology. They include what appear to be pyramidal forms, rectangular buildings, and linear features that could be walls or roads. The data was published in scientific journals with cautious language about unusual geological formations that require further study, but independent researchers examining the same data saw clear evidence of artificial structures. In 2012, satellite thermal imaging detected heat signatures in several locations in Antarctica, including areas near von Neurath's mapped structures. These heat sources cannot be explained by known geothermal activity alone. Some researchers believe they indicate active technology still functioning beneath the ice, possibly power generation systems or other devices that continue to operate despite being abandoned for thousands of years. Official explanations attribute the heat to volcanic activity or unusual geological conditions. But the patterns do not match what would be expected from natural geothermal sources. The heat signatures are too localized, too consistent, and in some cases appear to pulse or vary in ways suggesting artificial regulation rather than geological randomness. In 2016, a team of British researchers using ground-penetrating radar technology surveyed a portion of East Antarctica and detected what they described as a massive void beneath the ice, a chamber over 3 kilometers long and nearly 1 kilometer wide at a depth of approximately 200 meters below the surface. The official report described it as a subglacial lake, but the shape and structure did not match typical subglacial lakes. The sealing of the void was too regular, the dimensions too precise. Some researchers who examined the data believed they were looking at an artificial chamber, possibly a hangar or storage facility large enough to house numerous aircraft or vehicles. The location of this void matched remarkably well with one of the areas von Neurath had identified as showing multiple surface structures, suggesting the structures extended into massive underground complexes. In recent years, several individuals claiming to have knowledge of classified Antarctic operations have come forward, risking their careers and possibly their safety to reveal what they know. In 2015, a former U.S. Navy flight engineer, using the pseudonym Brian, claimed in an interview that he had been part of a classified mission that flew into restricted Antarctic regions in 1994, according to his account. They landed near massive structures emerging from the ice, structures that matched descriptions from the von Neurath maps, though he was not aware of those maps at the time. He described seeing carved stone or possibly metal surfaces with symbols that looked like advanced mathematics or writing systems. He claimed their mission was to retrieve samples and conduct survey measurements, and that everything was classified under protocols he had never encountered in his regular military service. When asked why the structures were kept secret, he said the official reason given was that premature disclosure would create international conflicts over Antarctic territorial claims. But he suspected the real reason was that governments did not want to acknowledge advanced ancient civilizations because it would raise too many uncomfortable questions about human history and potentially about non-human intelligence. Another whistleblower, this one a scientist claiming to have worked at McMurdo Station in the early 2000s, stated in an online post that research teams regularly encountered anomalies that were not reported in official scientific publications. According to this source, certain areas of Antarctica were off limits to regular researchers, designated as military zones or restricted for environmental reasons, but the real purpose was to prevent civilian scientists from discovering structures or artifacts that had been found by classified programs. This source claimed to have seen photographs brought back from restricted zones showing carved walls and metallic objects that could not be explained as natural formations. When this person attempted to ask questions about these images, they were told to forget what they had seen and were subsequently transferred to a different project. The message was clear: certain discoveries were not to be acknowledged or discussed. These testimonies, while impossible to fully verify, are consistent with each other and with the earlier accounts from von Neurath and from Operation High Jump participants. They suggest an ongoing pattern of discovery, classification, and suppression that has continued for decades. The structures are there, various teams have found them, but official acknowledgement never comes. Instead, the discoveries are classified, studied in secret, and the public narrative maintains that Antarctica is just ice and rock with no significant archaeological or historical importance. This controlled narrative serves multiple purposes. It prevents public pressure for transparency and international cooperation in studying the structures. It allows military and intelligence agencies to continue investigating without scrutiny. And it protects the established historical narrative from revolutionary challenges that might destabilize educational institutions and cultural assumptions about human origins and development. Perhaps the most significant aspect of von Neurath's discoveries is the question of technology. If the Antarctic structures were built by an advanced ancient civilization, what level of technology did they possess? Von Neurath's observations provide clues. Yet the precision of construction with massive stone or possibly metal blocks fitted together with minimal gaps suggests either advanced cutting tools or some method of shaping stone that we do not understand. The scale of the structures, with some possibly extending hundreds of meters underground, indicates engineering capabilities for excavation and structural support far beyond what we attribute to ancient peoples. The cylindrical object found in the main chamber, emitting electromagnetic energy and apparently functioning after thousands or possibly millions of years, suggests power generation or energy storage technology that surpasses anything modern science has achieved. If such technology exists and can be recovered and understood, the implications are staggering. Energy generation systems that function indefinitely without fuel would make fossil fuels obsolete overnight, completely transforming the global economy and power structures built on energy scarcity. Construction techniques that can shape stone with precision we cannot match would revolutionize architecture and engineering. Materials that do not degrade over geological time spans would transform manufacturing and create possibilities for infrastructure and devices of unimaginable durability. This is why governments would want to control access to such discoveries. Public release of ancient advanced technology would destroy existing industries, redistribute power globally, and force acknowledgement that our current civilization is not the pinnacle of human achievement, but possibly a step backward from what was achieved by predecessors we have forgotten. Some researchers believe that ancient technology has already been recovered and is being studied in classified programs, possibly even partially reverse engineered and incorporated into modern systems under the cover of conventional invention. The rapid technological advancement in the 20th century, particularly the sudden breakthroughs in physics, materials science, and computer technology, could be explained partially by conventional scientific progress. But what if some of that progress was accelerated by knowledge gained from ancient sources? What if certain key innovations were not invented but discovered, found in ancient ruins and then repackaged as modern inventions to hide their true origins? This theory is speculative and difficult to prove, but it would explain some anomalies in the history of technology, including instances where inventors seem to make intuitive leaps that could not be fully explained by the experimental data available to them. Von Neurath himself speculated about this in his later writings. He wondered if the Nazis had found something in Antarctica that contributed to their advanced rocket technology and other weapons programs. He noted that German scientific progress in certain areas during the war seemed surprisingly rapid, almost as if they had access to knowledge or blueprints that allowed them to skip conventional developmental steps. But while most historians attribute German technological achievements to excellent conventional science and engineering, von Neurath believed there might be more to the story. He knew what the Nazis had found in Antarctica, and he knew how desperately they wanted to exploit it. Did they succeed in recovering some technology before the war ended? The question remains unanswered, lost in the classified archives that still conceal the full truth about what was discovered beneath the Antarctic ice. Von Neurath's discovery of similarities between Antarctic symbols and those found in ancient sites in South America and the Middle East supports a controversial hypothesis that a global civilization existed before recorded history, a civilization that was destroyed in a cataclysm but left remnants scattered across the world. Now, this hypothesis has been proposed by various researchers over the decades, most famously by Graham Hancock and others who point to evidence of advanced knowledge in ancient cultures that supposedly should not have possessed it. Precision astronomy encoded in ancient temples, sophisticated mathematics in pyramid construction, detailed anatomical knowledge in ancient medical texts, and maritime technologies that allowed ocean crossing at times when conventional history says such voyages were impossible. All of this suggests that ancient peoples inherited knowledge from an older source. The Antarctic structures could be remnants of this older source, one of the centers of the pre-cataclysm global civilization. The similarities in symbols suggest cultural or technological exchange between Antarctica and other regions at a time when Antarctica was not frozen and was possibly a temperate or even tropical climate zone, supporting large populations. Geological evidence indicates that Antarctica was not always ice-covered. Continental drift has moved Antarctica to its current polar position gradually over millions of years, but even in relatively recent geological time, parts of the continent may have been ice-free. The Peary Race map and other ancient maps that appear to show Antarctica without ice suggest that someone mapped the coastline when it was accessible, implying human or at least intelligent presence during one of these ice-free periods. If a global civilization existed and Antarctica was one of its centers, what caused its destruction? The most likely candidate is the cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,800 years ago, when massive climate change, sea level rise, and possibly cosmic impacts devastated civilizations worldwide. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, causing immediate catastrophic effects and triggering climate changes that ended the Ice Age abruptly. Such an event would have destroyed coastal cities through tsunamis and floods, buried inland cities under sediment and debris, and disrupted agriculture and social structures to the point where complex civilizations collapsed. Survivors would have regressed to more primitive states, losing much of their advanced knowledge and technology. Only fragments would be preserved, would pass down through oral traditions that eventually became myths and legends. The Antarctic structures, if they were built before this cataclysm, would have been buried in ice as the climate changed and Antarctica froze. This would preserve them better than structures in other regions that were exposed to erosion, vegetation growth. The Antarctic structures, if they were built before this cataclysm, would have been buried in ice as the climate changed and Antarctica froze. This would preserve them better than structures in other regions that were exposed to erosion, vegetation growth, and human destruction over millennia. While temples in Egypt were defaced by later dynasties, while libraries in Mesopotamia burned, while megalithic sites in South America were dismantled by conquistadors. The Antarctic structures remained sealed under kilometers of ice, protected from both natural degradation and human interference. Von Neurath understood this preservation mechanism intuitively. In his journals, he speculated that if researchers could access these structures and study them properly, they might find technology and knowledge that had been completely lost in other locations. He wrote about the possibility that the Antarctic city might contain libraries or data storage systems that preserved information from before the cataclysm, information about the origins of human civilization, about scientific knowledge that we have had to rediscover slowly over thousands of years, about technologies that we still do not understand. He imagined that future generations with better technology than existed in 1939 that might be able to excavate the structures, translate the writing, and unlock secrets that would transform human civilization. But he also feared that if the wrong people gained access first, if military powers or corporations controlled the discoveries, the knowledge would be weaponized or monopolized rather than shared for the benefit of all humanity. This fear drove many of his later actions, including his decision to work with Allied intelligence and his creation of multiple copies of his maps and documentation. He wanted to ensure that no single power could control what had been found, that the information would survive even if he did not, and that eventually the truth would reach people who would use it wisely. His maps were his insurance policy, yet his way of guaranteeing that the structures he found would not be forgotten or completely controlled by governments and military organizations. Every copy he made, every journal entry he wrote, was an act of resistance against the forces of suppression and secrecy. He knew his discoveries were too important to be buried in classified archives forever, and he did everything in his power to ensure they would eventually see the light of day and human interference over thousands of years. The ice acted as a protective seal, maintaining the structures in something close to their original condition, waiting to be discovered when technology advanced enough to detect and access them. Von Neurath understood this preservation mechanism, and he realized that Antarctica might contain the best preserved examples of pre-cataclysm civilization anywhere on Earth. If his maps could lead researchers to these structures, and if proper scientific investigation were allowed, we might finally answer questions about human origins, the development of civilization, and the capabilities of our ancient ancestors that have puzzled us for centuries. Why has evidence like von Neurath's maps been suppressed for over 70 years? The answer lies in understanding how information control works in modern societies. It is not usually a matter of deliberate conspiracy in the sense of a small group consciously hiding truth from everyone else. Rather, it is a system of institutional biases, classification protocols, career incentives, and cultural assumptions that collectively work to suppress information that challenges established narratives. Academic institutions have enormous resistance to revolutionary ideas that would invalidate decades of published research and teaching. Scientists and professors who have built careers on specific paradigms will instinctively resist evidence that contradicts those paradigms, not necessarily through conscious dishonesty, but through cognitive bias and institutional self-preservation. Peer review, which is supposed to ensure quality control, can become a mechanism for enforcing conformity, where unconventional papers are rejected not because they are poorly researched, but because they challenge assumptions that reviewers are committed to defending. Government classification systems create another layer of suppression. Materials are classified for many reasons, some legitimate, such as protecting military capabilities or intelligence sources, others more questionable, such as avoiding political embarrassment or maintaining power structures. Once something is classified, it becomes very difficult to declassify. There are protocols and timelines, but materials relating to truly sensitive topics can remain classified indefinitely through regular renewal of classification status. The people making these renewal decisions are often not the original classifiers and may not fully understand what they are protecting or why, but institutional momentum keeps the classification in place. Add to this the fact that classified materials often reveal things that would be inconvenient for current power structures. If the von Neurath maps were declassified and confirmed that ancient civilizations were more advanced than ours in some ways, this would undermine narratives of inevitable progress and Western superiority that serve political and economic interests. There is also the matter of cultural control, the story we tell ourselves about history, about how civilization developed and where we came from, shapes our identity and our understanding of what is possible. If people believe that civilization is a recent development, that we have progressed from primitive to advanced in a linear fashion, and that modern Western civilization represents the peak of human achievement, then they will accept current social and economic structures as natural and inevitable. But if people learn that advanced civilizations existed before, that they achieved things we cannot replicate, and that they were destroyed despite their capabilities, then current structures look much more fragile and contingent. People might start questioning whether progress is inevitable, whether our leaders actually know what they are doing, whether the systems we live under are really the best possible arrangements. This questioning threatens those in power, so there is incentive to maintain narratives that support the status quo. Von Neurath recognized this suppression machine even as it was being deployed against him. In his manuscript, he wrote about feeling caught in a web of institutional forces that valued control over truth. He saw how his discoveries were taken from him and locked away, not because they were false, but because they were too true, too threatening to comfortable lies that societies depend on. He died frustrated and silenced, his life's most important work hidden from the world, his name absent from the history books that should have celebrated him as one of the great explorers and discoverers. His story is not unique. Throughout history, individuals who discovered uncomfortable truths have been marginalized, ridiculed, or erased. The difference is that von Neurath documented everything meticulously, created multiple copies, and found ways to preserve his evidence despite the suppression. His maps survived, his photographs survived, his journals survived. And eventually the truth they contain is emerging into public awareness, no matter how much the suppression machine tries to contain it. In 2018, 79 years after von Neurath's Antarctic expedition, a portion of his materials finally reached the public through a complex series of events involving his granddaughter, a sympathetic archivist, and researchers who understood the significance of what they were seeing. The archivist, working in a German military history collection, discovered von Neurath's hidden set of maps and journals that had been misfiled or possibly deliberately hidden in archives that were being digitized for public access. Rather than reporting the discovery through official channels where the materials might be reclassified and disappeared again, the archivist made digital copies and contacted researchers who had been investigating Nazi Antarctic expeditions. So these researchers verified the authenticity of the materials and arranged for publication through academic channels that could not easily be suppressed. The release caused immediate controversy. Mainstream archaeologists and historians dismissed the maps as either fraudulent or misinterpreted, claiming the structures von Neurath documented were natural formations that he mistakenly identified as artificial. But independent analysis by geologists and engineers came to different conclusions. The geometric precision, the consistent architectural features, and the similarities to known artificial structures made the natural formation explanation implausible. Some mainstream scientists, willing to consider alternative explanations, suggested the structures might be remnants of Nazi construction, and that the expedition actually built installations that were later abandoned and buried in ice. This theory was quickly debunked by analysis showing that the structures were far too large and too deeply buried to have been built during the brief 1938-39 expedition, and that Nazi Germany lacked the resources and technology to construct such massive works in Antarctica, even if they had wanted to. The release of the maps also prompted new interest in conducting expeditions to verify von Neurath's findings. Several organizations announced plans to send teams to the coordinates he provided, using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to map what lies beneath the ice without necessarily excavating. However, these expeditions faced numerous obstacles. Permits required under the Antarctic Treaty were denied or delayed indefinitely. Funding sources that initially expressed interest withdrew support, often after being contacted by government officials expressing concerns about the expeditions. Equipment shipments were held up in customs or went missing. The message was clear. Even 79 years later, someone did not want these structures investigated. The suppression continued, now operating through bureaucratic obstacles rather than direct classification, but just as effective at preventing the truth from being fully established. Some expedition attempts did succeed, at least partially. In 2019, a private team using long-range drones equipped with radar mapping technology flew over portions of the area von Neurath had mapped. Yet their data confirmed the presence of large, regular structures beneath the ice at locations matching von Neurath's coordinates. Before they could publish their findings, however, their data was confiscated by authorities claiming violations of Antarctic treaty protocols. The team members were threatened with legal action if they released any information, and their equipment was seized. One team member who spoke anonymously said the authorities seemed less concerned about environmental protection and more concerned about preventing documentation of the structures. The confiscation was so aggressive and the legal threats so severe that it suggested the structures were exactly what von Neurath claimed and that powerful interests were still determined to keep them hidden, despite all efforts at suppression. The truth about the Antarctic structures is gradually emerging into public consciousness. Technology has made information harder to control. Satellite imagery is available to anyone with internet access. Independent researchers can analyze data that governments cannot easily censor. Whistleblowers can release information through channels that did not exist in earlier decades. The von Neurath maps have been digitized and shared widely, making it impossible to suppress them completely. Even if official expeditions are blocked, the evidence is out there for anyone willing to look at it objectively. What remains is the question of interpretation and what we do with the knowledge. If we accept that the Antarctic structures are real, that they were built by an advanced ancient civilization, and that they may contain technology beyond our current capabilities, then we face profound choices. Do we demand transparency from governments and international organizations about what has been found and studied in classified programs? Do we push for properly funded, scientifically rigorous investigations of the structures open to international participation and public scrutiny? Do we prepare ourselves mentally and culturally for a rewriting of human history that acknowledges our ancestors achieved things we do not yet understand? Or do we turn away, choose comfortable ignorance, and allow the suppression to continue because the truth is too disturbing to confront? Von Neurath's maps are an invitation to choose knowledge over ignorance, truth over comfortable lies. They show us that history is not what we have been taught. That civilizations rose and fell long before we thought civilization existed, and that beneath the ice lies evidence that could transform our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The structures are still there, waiting. The technology may still be functional, waiting to be understood and utilized. The knowledge encoded in the symbols on those ancient walls waits to be deciphered. All of this is possible if we have the courage to pursue it, if we demand that the secrecy end and that humanity's shared heritage be studied openly rather than hoarded by governments and military organizations. The story of Klaus von Neurath is ultimately a story about the conflict between truth and power. He discovered something extraordinary, documented it with scientific precision, but tried to ensure the information would be preserved and shared. But power wanted the information controlled, classified, suppressed. For decades, power won. The maps were locked away, the truth was hidden, and von Neurath died without seeing his work acknowledged. But truth has a way of surviving. It persists in documents hidden in archives, in copies secreted away by those who understood their value, in the physical evidence that remains in Antarctica no matter how much officials want to deny its existence. And eventually, through the work of researchers, whistleblowers, and ordinary people who refuse to accept official narratives, truth emerges. We are living in the moment when the truth about Antarctica is emerging. The structures that von Neurath mapped in 1938 are being confirmed by modern technology. Yet the symbols he photographed are being analyzed by linguists and mathematicians. The questions he raised about ancient civilizations and lost technology are being asked by growing numbers of people who see the evidence and demand answers. The suppression is failing, not because those in power have changed their minds about wanting control, but because information technology and cultural shifts have made suppression increasingly difficult. What was once successfully hidden can now be revealed. What was once successfully dismissed as conspiracy theory is now being taken seriously by credible researchers. The dam is breaking. The German cartographer who mapped Antarctica in 1938 gave us a gift, evidence that survived decades of suppression, maps that can guide us to discoveries that will reshape human history. Yet Klaus von Neurath never lived to see his work vindicated, never saw expeditions return to the structures he found, never saw the truth he documented become accepted by mainstream science. But his legacy survives in the maps and journals he preserved, in the questions he raised that we are now finally beginning to answer, and in the example he set of choosing truth over expediency, documentation over denial, and hope that eventually knowledge will prevail over ignorance. The structures are beneath the ice, exactly where his maps say they are. The truth is there for us to find if we have the courage to look. The only question is whether we will choose to see what is actually there, or will we continue accepting comfortable lies that protect power structures but leave us ignorant of our true history and potential. The ice is melting, as both literally and metaphorically. Climate change is exposing parts of Antarctica that have been buried for millennia, revealing structures and artifacts that can no longer be easily hidden. And the metaphorical ice of official denial and suppression is melting under the heat of public demand for transparency and the light of evidence that keeps emerging despite all efforts to contain it. We are approaching a moment when the official narrative will no longer be sustainable, when the evidence will be so overwhelming that acknowledgement becomes inevitable. When that moment comes, when governments and institutions finally admit that advanced ancient civilizations existed and that remnants of their technology wait beneath Antarctic ice, we will look back at this time and ask why it took so long. We will ask why evidence was suppressed for so many decades, why researchers like von Neurath were silenced, why humanity was kept ignorant of its own history. And we will need to ensure that the answers to these questions lead to systemic changes that prevent such suppression from happening again. The maps that Klaus von Neurath created are more than geographical documents. They are a challenge to every official narrative that denies the possibility of advanced ancient civilizations. They are evidence that demands investigation rather than dismissal. They are a call to adventure for those willing to pursue truth wherever it leads, even when that truth threatens established power and comfortable assumptions. The structures are there. The evidence is real. The truth is waiting. The only question is whether we are ready to accept it and to deal with its implications for how we understand ourselves, our history, and our place in the cosmic story of intelligence and civilization. Klaus von Neurath did his part. He found the structures, mapped them precisely, and preserved the evidence. Now it is our turn to decide what we do with what he gave us. Will we demand the truth, or will we accept continued suppression? Will we explore what lies beneath the ice, or will we turn away? The choice is ours, but the consequences of that choice will echo through generations to come. The German cartographer who mapped Antarctica in 1938, his charts showed structures that shouldn't exist.